Well, welcome to the final full week of this summer course. I'd like this video to serve as an introduction to both the week 4 activity as well as the few days left in week 5. So this will be my last sort of kind of instruction-focused message to you, via video anyway. And I'm feeling pretty good today. Well, week 4, I'm representing with my Highlander Pride shirt on today. I don't know why I woke up with a just with a strong sense of go Radford. It's the hottest day of summer, and I'm wearing my long sleeve Radford shirt. But I'm glad to be with you at this point in the journey, and so let me talk just a little bit about what's happening this week and why I think it's really important. So last week, for the part of the project that you completed and submitted, it dealt with you designing the positivist aspect of your mixed method research proposal. And this week, because you finished learning about interpretivist models and you just finished taking an assessment over that, this week you're asked to apply those concepts to the design of your interpretivist aspects of your mixed method sort of studies. And so I want to talk just a little bit about why that's so important, and it's a very personal or very real story for me. So here goes. Many years ago, I mean more than 20 years ago, when I was a young researcher, a young faculty member, younger I should say, I was working on a project associated with this new concept that was being implemented in universities, and the concept was how could they use computers to help effectively deliver self-directed instruction in the most effective ways possible. Because at that point, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, network computers were just becoming part of the massive landscape in universities, and by connected I mean connected easily to each other and then to home computers, laptop use, and all of that. And there was this installation at Virginia Tech, just down the road from Radford, that was put in with a massive grant from Apple Computers, and it was a giant kind of self-directed lab for learning math called the Math Emporium, and it's still there now. If you've ever been to Virginia Tech as a student or you've just visited, you may have heard of the Math Emporium. Well, 25 years ago, it was a fairly new concept. And one of the reasons why math was kind of used as sort of the guinea pig for a massive computer-supported learning is that at that time it was very, very common for math programs, especially at the lower division level, the 100 and 200 level classes, freshman and sophomore math classes, to have these big giant sections of math that were completely self-directed. You got a math book that was kind of like a workbook, and you worked your way through, and then you had to go to testing centers to take exams, and those testing centers started out as just sort of the bubble sheet, Scantron centers that were only put into place in terms of having to be there in person because of security reasons, because you had to show your ID and indicate that it was you taking those exams. But everything else associated with the class was delivered instructionally in these books that were written specifically for that in mind. And you could go to small sort of support study groups throughout the week I know that was my experience with math the first time I took a math class at university. Self-directed, had the big testing centers, and then there were these support classes that you could go to. And in my case, I went to a very large university, and a lot of the graduate assistants or teaching assistants in math were international students, which is great. They knew a lot about math, but communication wasn't always the most the strong suit of these teaching assistants, and so it was hard to understand what was being said, and I was intimidated regarding wanting to ask questions because I didn't want to feel stupid because I couldn't understand the answer, and not just because it was math. So I was not that successful in that environment, to be honest with you. But with the advent of computers, there was this notion that perhaps if you took those books, the information that was in those books, and you put it on a computer, and with practice where you got immediate feedback and that kind of thing, then you might be able to improve the overall success rate of those kind of large math classes. And so it was at the Math Emporium and other places like that in those early days. So as a young researcher, I was asked to be part of a research team to investigate the effectiveness of a very similar type of major computer-based math laboratory, but it was very large. I mean, there were hundreds of computers, and so I was part of this research and evaluation team that went in 1 year and tried to measure and look at the success of this thing. So it's very similar to what you're being asked to do in terms of an intervention, because in this case, this was an actual study where there was a comparison between students who were assigned to the computer-based environment and students who were assigned the more traditional, at that time, the more traditional way, which is just these self-directed books. And we were there to study overall effectiveness. In my field of study, we called that, in some ways, it was a media comparison, and that is what medium seemed to be more effective at providing an instructional experience for students. In this case, it was the books, the more traditional approach versus this computer lab approach. But of course, there were other elements or other variables that defined differences between the students in those two groups. One of the most important that I saw was that at that time, you had to be in the laboratory in order to experience the math instruction. It was all online, but it wasn't internet-based where you could access it from anywhere. You had to be in that particular lab. That's just the way the software was set up back then. So I was really interested to study the behavior of the students who had to go to the lab to experience pretty much all of the math instruction within a confined environment. But what we were mostly interested in terms of variables of interest, the dependent variables, were how successful the students did in the class as measured by the assessment scores and then overall grades. And we were just going to compare those two initially. That's what it started out being. So it was really simple, a really basic pre-test, post-test control group design, in that the people with the math books were the control group because that was the normal way of doing things, and the experimental group were those who were randomly assigned to sections where they used the computers. And we had our simple dependent variable. Well, as part of the research, I went into the lab because I'd actually never been in that kind of an environment before. And I went in there at the beginning of the year just to sit there and watch, to be honest with you. I wasn't there initially to formally record any data regarding student behavior, or I didn't go up and interview anybody initially or anything like that. I just went there to visit and to see the operation in action, so that when I was going to write about it, I would be able to be descriptive about what I wrote about. But to be honest, I found it right away. I found it very interesting just to be there in that environment. I think at the beginning of the year, I sensed a general level of kind of excitement about these students coming in, getting their seat at the computers, paying close attention to what was on the screen, scrolling through, clicking through. I watched that. I watched people taking notes and recording them down on various, in various ways, and I watched that early on in the semester. But as I would visit this place sort of regularly, I noticed after a few weeks of the semester starting, I started to notice a lot of behaviors that seemed to be very common, and that was a lot of very bored looks, people kind of resting their head on the desk and clicking through things. It didn't look like there was much engagement at all. It looked like scrolling through a lot of information. And as I watched more closely, I would see students scrolling through stuff so that they could just get to the practice and try the practice, which, again, as part of the computer program, you had to scroll through a lot of things. And honestly, after a few weeks, these students looked very bored. And as I was sitting there watching them, I had some students, I was kind of in a lounge area at one point, and there were students there who were waiting for computers to be freed, because this place was packed all the time. And I just started talking to them a little bit about their experiences in this environment. And it was pretty telling. I learned a lot about how some of these students felt about having to come to the lab. And honestly, by the middle of the semester, it sure seemed like the students who were part of the computer-based group had a lot of resentment compared to the students who were in the book group, because they were tied to this place, and there was no food or drink allowed in the computer lab. And so that seemed to be important. There were a lot of people sneaking food out of their backpacks, secretly, and people getting kicked out for that behavior, among other things. And I learned a lot about it. And I can assure you now that here we are 20 years later, and if you were to go back to one of those labs now, or go to the Math Emporium at Virginia Tech, you would see a very different environment. You'd see a lot more small groups working together. You'll see food lounges. You'll see a Starbucks in the computer area. You'll see a lot of small group instruction, and of course you'll see that students aren't tied to the lab anymore, because the instruction is available both in the lab and at home, but the labs are still used as secure testing areas. So you're still compelled to go there at different times. But whether or not it was more successful in terms of academically, what we found is that it was not more successful. It wasn't that different. But there were other factors you could have measured to determine the value of that environment, whether or not there were fewer human beings that had to be hired to do that work. I don't know, because I didn't look at that part of the study. That wasn't a variable that I was measuring or looking at. But I will definitely tell you that I learned more about the value of that kind of an experience from the learner's perspective by just being there and watching and observing and asking questions of the students who were there. So in that case, I had an interpretivist research experience. It wasn't planned, but it was one nonetheless, and I can assure you it was more valuable to me than just looking at the hard data of test performance. And of course, had I planned an interpretivist experience as part of that scholarly activity, I could have used any one of the types of interpretivist methods that are presented in the notes. I could have used a case study where I just looked at one student and I followed them around through that experience, and I studied how they interacted with things and what they thought about and what were the materials that they wrote down, what notes were they taking. Seems to me like that would be really important. So I could have done that case study. I could have done a focus group. I could have could have asked 5 or 6 people who were going through that experience to meet me in a little room, and I'd have a prepared set of questions to ask them and some open-ended stuff and let them talk to each other about it. That can be very valuable. That's a very rich experience in terms of a research experience. So could have done a focus group. And of course, I could have continued to do what I was doing, which was really more of an ethnography, and that is just planting myself in that environment. I could have gone through the class, to be honest with you, as a student, and looked at it really from the inside, from the deep inside, and I could have written that story. Again, the information and data that I would have collected from that interpretivist experience, to me, in that environment, would have been just as valuable from a research perspective as simply trying to prove whether or not that environment was as effective instructionally as what they already had. Because to be honest with you, I don't think what they already had was that instructionally effective. So that's why interpretivism, that's why you're being asked to consider and to plan for an interpretivist aspect to your research proposal, because I can assure you, if you were really going to do this research, you would want to look at it from that angle, from that perspective, in addition to the positivist stuff that I'm asking you to do, which is maybe looking at test scores or attitudes and that kind of thing formally. So that's why it's really important to consider both of those types of methodologies when you're looking at research and planning it yourself or reading it and trying to figure out the value of the research. And speaking of value, so you've got 2 more chapters to consider in the Willingham book. Week 4 asks you to analyze some existing research that has been conducted. So last week you had to find some examples of research or scholarly writing associated with lumosity and try to figure out, well, who wrote that? Where were they coming from? Why were they interested in studying lumosity the way that they studied it? Well, this week, in terms of analyze it, you're going to be asked to look at 3 actual studies that were conducted and published, all of them in peer-reviewed journals. And I'm going to have you, after you read the chapter, you're going to look at some specific information that I want you to get from those articles, and then in the final week